Good evening, everybody. It's an honor to be here tonight with Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. Professor Taylor is a professor of African American Studies at Princeton and the author of several books, including, as many of you know, Race for Profit, How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Homeownership. Race for Profit was a semifinalist for a National Book Award for Nonfiction and a 2020 finalist for the Pulitzer in History. Taylor's book, from hashtag Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, won the Lannan Cultural Freedom Award for an especially notable book in 2016. And many of you know also that Professor Taylor was awarded a MacArthur Foundation quote unquote genius fellowship earlier this year. She is also the 2021 recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship. And of course, Taylor is also a contributing writer for The New Yorker. But more importantly, tonight, Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor is a native New Yorker, not of Brooklyn, but Buffalo, another lovely bee place. And if she were here in person, which of course she is not able to be because of the current circumstances, we would be able to take her around Brooklyn and introduce her to our fruit streets, not Buffalo's fruit streets. We have pineapple, not lemon, but I hope that if you are here, Professor Taylor, you would see a lot of similarities between the city you know and the city that we know and love. I just want to let everybody know and emphasize that Professor Taylor, although she has written an extraordinary book about the law and its impact on race and inequality, is not a lawyer. She is an historian, and I think that is something wonderful about her work. That she engages so deeply with the law, but does not have the training that you have all embarked on. So I am excited about this conversation and look forward to hearing Professor Taylor's remarks. And then after Professor Taylor speaks, we'll welcome two members of the curriculum committee, student members of the curriculum committee, to join us to talk about her work, to share questions submitted by over 100 questions submitted by the 1L students. I don't think we're going to ask you 100 questions, Professor Taylor, but we're gonna do our best to really connect you with the ideas that our students have shared and the questions they have an opportunity, an extraordinary opportunity to ask of you. So at this moment, I would like you to give a warm virtual welcome to Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that very warm introduction. I will say that I lived in New York for about 5 years in the 1990s, and I was a student at City College for 3 of those years, and so this is particularly exciting opportunity for me to come and connect with folks. So thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to talk with you about my book, Race for Profit. What I'm going to do is I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, really to give a broad overview of some of the main themes of the book. For those of you who've read the book, there's a lot going on in this book. And so that in and of itself is difficult to synthesize. There are several different threads that I try to maintain throughout the course of the book. So what I want to try to do is just to give a broad sense, narrative really, of what this book is and the stories that it is trying to tell, and its implications for us today. In August 1967, nearly 2 weeks after riots in Detroit prompted the rare deployment of federal troops in an American city, dozens of demonstrators burst into the chamber of the House of Representatives, chanting, "Rats cause riots." Days earlier, Congress had rejected a 2-year, $40 million bill to exterminate rats in inner cities across the United States. The protesters sat in the gallery of the hall for 20 minutes, repeating the slogan, "We want a rat bill." The previous attempt at passing the bill had not merely been voted down, but had been ridiculed in the process. a Virginia Republican mocked the legislation to howls of laughter from other white representatives, saying, quote, "Mr. Speaker, I think the rat smart thing for us to do is to vote this rat bill down right now." One of his colleagues mocked it as another civil rights bill. No laughing matter for people who lived in the inner city. Rats were the most visceral example of the unequal living conditions forced onto Black people in mid-century America. In the 1960s, African-American media regularly reported on rat attacks on the most vulnerable members of Black urban households, children. Lorraine McTush, a single African-American mother, complained to a Chicago Defender reporter that she stayed up most nights because of rats, the rats crawling in her bed, which made her nervous, and the rats in her children's bed, which terrified her. She said, "They get into the bunk beds, and so I sit up all night. I am miserable and afraid." The rat infestation in Black neighborhoods was profound. When African-American children in a Chicago neighborhood were given a vocabulary test and asked to identify various familiar objects, more than 60% of the children misidentified a rat as a teddy bear. In the aftermath of riots in Philadelphia in 1964, a city commissioned report found that 100% of reported rat bites happened in segregated Black majority neighborhoods. Housing segregation, maintained through a vexing combination of white violence, public policy, and the exclusionary practices of the private sector, ensured the dilapidated and substandard condition of Black housing. By the end of the 1960s, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kerner Commission, had left no doubt that substandard housing, evidenced by rat infestation, was a recurring factor in the annual bouts of riots that roiled American cities throughout the decade. Identifying segregation at the root of those conditions and as a significant source of rage in Black communities, the Commission's findings called for historic changes to American housing policies. A landmark Supreme Court case, Jones versus Mayer, decided just weeks after the passage of the Fair Housing Act in the spring of 1968, drew upon the 1866 Civil Rights Act and the 13th Amendment in comparing housing segregation to slavery, arguing that, quote, "When racial discrimination herds men into ghettos and makes their ability to buy property turn on the color of their skin, then it is a relic of slavery." The final piece of the battle to open the US housing market to African Americans came with the Housing and Urban Development Act in August of 1968. The 1968 Hud Act was Lyndon Johnson's last greatest legislative accomplishment. It was a bill planned in collaboration with representatives from private enterprise and what was known as the Kaiser Commission. The businessmen who participated described their promotion of single-family homeownership for poor people as, quote, "socio-commercial enterprise," or business with a conscience. Johnson would go on to describe the legislation as the Magna Carta for the cities, but its focus on the market and ownership ensured that it was a bipartisan bill. For decades, federal officials had relied upon public housing to shelter poor and low-income people. But by the end of the 1960s, public housing had become politically untenable, with endless jousts over its maintenance, location, and inhabitants. Housing for the poor suffered from a mixture of government neglect and shrinking tenancy, a result of the dangerous conditions endured by residents and the constant pressure for such housing to exclude anyone other than the poorest tenants. The HUD Act was a pivot away from the notion of public or state responsibility for housing the poor or low income. At the heart of this new legislation was a low-income homeownership plan that aimed to transform low-income renters into homeowners. Federal officials turned to homeownership as a cheaper program where the costs of houses was absorbed by the program participants, while the federal government paid subsidies necessary to keep the costs cheap. This meant that the federal government could make payments over time as opposed to the upfront expenses necessary to develop, build, and manage public housing. These economic concerns also fit with the growing idea that homeownership could stabilize the anger and restiveness coursing through American cities. Freshman Senator Charles H. Percy, a Republican from Illinois, described the benefits of expanding homeownership as a new dawn of opportunity on which a new national effort to bring dignity and a better life to today's slum dwellers must be based. We can democratize our cities. We can give people of the ghetto a piece of the action, let them be somebody and achieve something. President Richard Nixon said of the bill, "People who own their own homes don't burn their neighborhoods. Rather, in pride and self-interest, they turn to fixing up their communities and making them livable for themselves and their neighborhoods." The terms of the new homeownership program were a low $200 down payment, 20% of a participant's income as their mortgage, regardless of the cost of the house, and an interest rate that was capped at 1%. The inclusion of federal mortgage insurance for the first time meant that in the worst case scenario, a foreclosure or abandonment, the federal government was obligated to pay back the mortgage to the lender. These terms kept the price of the homes low and manageable for low income and working people. It also removed almost all of the risk from the real estate industry. As one official described the program, it's like, he said, quote, "It's like doing business in heaven. You can't lose money." The unprecedented program linked federal agencies to real estate brokers and mortgage bankers to supply the loans, housing loans and loans to people in neighborhoods, to supply loans to people in neighborhoods that had previously been excluded or redlined. But with the promise of lucrative subsidies and the guarantees of mortgage insurance and the promise of profit that came with them, the historic hostility of these private sector forces melted away. But the same conditions also opened new pathways for corrupt real estate practices. Speculators and brokers bought up cheap, dilapidated properties, hoping to flip them for higher prices and sales to people who had qualified for these new programs. The entirety of the program was in the hands of real estate operatives. HUD sent brokers lists of eligible properties. When real estate brokers matched a person with the house, they connected the prospective buyer with a mortgage lender. The mortgage lender consulted with HUD to determine if the person qualified for the program. At no time did an individual speak with the representative of the federal government. Not only could money be made by flipping cheap properties, but brokers found it easy to bribe poorly paid FHA, Federal Housing Administrative appraisers to inflate the value of the houses in this new urban market. Bankers made money on the front end of the real estate deal by securing the loan, and then they made money on the back end with expensive closing costs associated with selling the property. Everyone made money, except the poor Black families that were disproportionately saddled with these broken homes in cities across the country. One homeowner turned activist described this as collusion. She said, quote, "The outright murder of our neighborhoods in America, aided and abetted by the Federal Housing Administration, the mortgage industry, the insurance industry, and the unscrupulous real estate industry. These four institutions are working together to systematically destroy what's left of American cities. What for so long has been considered a natural phenomenon, changing neighborhoods, deteriorating cities, are not natural. It is an outright plan, and the government, the realtors, and the big money people are making a lot of money out of changing neighborhoods, out of the communities that we call home." The federal government's turn to home ownership was a consummate expression of post-war racial liberalism that viewed inclusion into American democracy through the vehicles of citizenship, law, and free market capitalism as the key to unlocking equality and social mobility for Black citizens, as it had been for white Americans through the New Deal and the GI Bill, after World War II. But in narrowing their focus to access alone, racial liberals overlooked the racist practices embedded within those institutions. This was shockingly clear in the real estate industry. Banks and the real estate industry had played a central role in creating the urban housing crisis, exemplified by the persistent presence of rats in Black housing. So the sudden involvement of the same private sector forces was a recipe for disaster. But if rat infestation in the 1960s was evidence of racial segregation, substandard housing, and a catalyst for the rebellions throughout the 1960s, then their appearance in the federally subsidized homes owned by Black people in the 1970s punctured the delusion that simply transforming redlining into inclusion within a housing market built upon an edifice of racial discrimination, exploitative practices, and segregation could produce an equitable and just outcome. Instead, with minimal oversight and a steadfast sensitivity to the bottom line of the real estate and banking industries, the search for safe and sound housing foundered in foreclosures and abandonment. Consider the experiences of Janice Johnson. On September 18th, 1970, Janice Johnson bought her first home in Philadelphia with a mortgage guaranteed by the Federal Housing Administration. By all previous standards, Johnson was an atypical buyer. She was a Black single mother on welfare living with her 8-year-old son in a decaying apartment in a building that had recently been condemned by city officials in the working class Black neighborhood in North Philadelphia. Now facing eviction, Johnson needed to quickly find a new place to live when her mother told her of an apartment for rent in the same neighborhood. Johnson called the landlord in anticipation, but her hopes were dashed when he told her that she could not rent the apartment because she was a welfare recipient. He quickly pivoted from renting, though, to suggest that Janice Johnson buy a house in the same neighborhood. Within weeks, Johnson realized that her home was not the fulfillment of the American dream. It was the beginning of her American nightmare. Within days of moving into her new house, the sewer line broke, spewing wastewater all over the basement floor. Electricity for the house was sporadic and haphazard. There were holes and other irregularities in the foundation of the house. The compromised structure of the house was not the worst of it. On Halloween night, Johnson's son, Edward, woke up to find a rat in his bed. Johnson saw rats throughout her house, including in the kitchen and bathroom. Apparently, the holes in the basement harbored nests of rats that regularly entered the house. She called the agent who sold her the house to complain of its condition. He sent workmen out on a couple of occasions, and they even patched the falling plaster in her dining room. But soon after, the real estate agent reminded her that the problems in her house were now her own. They were what he called homeowner's business. For Janice Johnson, the new terms that allowed her and thousands of other women like her to buy new homes were what I describe as predatory inclusion. Predatory inclusion into the real estate market was evident when Black buyers were granted access to conventional real estate practices and mortgage financing, but on more expensive and comparatively unequal terms. The disproportionate conditions of poverty and dilapidation produced by years of public and private institutional neglect then became evidence of why Black buyers should be considered risky and thus treated differently within the housing market. Black buyers were also vulnerable to ongoing predatory practices because of the ways that residential segregation persisted, maintaining African Americans as a captured market, making them vulnerable to price inflation and exploitative real estate and banking practices when it came to secure housing. More generally, predatory inclusion described the ways that African Americans were welcomed into institutions and practices from which they had formerly been excluded because there were new ways in which they could be extracted from or financially exploited. Miserable and dangerous housing conditions in the existing urban market led people to walk away from their homes that they had recently purchased. And the numbers of defaults and foreclosures and FHA insurance payments began to rise. By the end of 1973, 10% of Section 235 homes, which is one of the homeownership programs, were in foreclosure, along with tens of thousands of others in other kinds of FHA assisted low-income homeownership programs. In May of 1974, HUD was in possession of 78,000 single-family homes that had been foreclosed upon through these programs. Indeed, congressional investigations into impropriety in the homeownership program showed that federal appraisers were taking bribes and inflating the value of dilapidated houses by 3 or 4 times their actual value. Local mortgage bankers were also accused of accepting bribes to ignore inconsistencies in paperwork needed to authorize the purchase and sale of a particular house. Newspaper reports and hundreds of federal indictments identified local FHA officials, appraisers, real estate agents, and mortgage lenders as all involved in the swindle. These were not only scandals, but crimes that had been committed against poor and working class Blacks and Latinos. In cities as diverse as Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Seattle, San Jose, California, Columbia, South Carolina, real estate brokers, FHA officials, and mortgage bankers were arrested and indicted for a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. By 1974, 28 HUD officials had been indicted for their role in the FHA housing scandal, along with other mortgage brokers and real estate brokers. But instead of focusing on the corrupt practices within the private sector, at the heart of these programs, policymakers scrutinized the homemaking skills and housekeeping abilities of Black women. The racist discourses of unfit Black mothers marshaling the perceived domestic dysfunction coursing through Black households guaranteed the ease with which blame for the decline of the homeownership programs could be attributed to apparent ineptitude of Black single-parent-led households. Elected officials, media, and the racially resentful white public were more than willing listeners. So even as hundreds of mostly white men were arrested for the criminal acts of fraud and corruption within the HUD homeownership program, George Romney, the secretary of HUD, insisted that, quote, housing by itself cannot solve the problems of people, particularly, he added, who may be suffering from bad habits, lawlessness, laziness, unemployment, inadequate education, low working skills, ill health, poor motivation, and a negative self-image. By 1974, 28 HUD officials had been indicted for their role in the housing scandal. In Romney's last act as secretary, he imposed a national moratorium on all subsidized housing programs, right in the midst of the end of the US economic boom and the onset of one of the worst economic recessions since the Great Depression. Nixon then used the HUD crisis to pivot towards the new Section 8 housing voucher program that fully divested the federal government from low-income homeownership. More generally, the discriminatory best practices of the real estate industry had made it resistant to change in adhering to new fair housing legislation. The benignly named public-private partnership obscured the ways that the federal government became complicit with private sector practices that promoted residential segregation and racial discrimination. Selling dilapidated homes to poor women who could not afford the repairs, like Janice Johnson, reinforced the idea of unfit Black owners who posed a threat to the quality of a neighborhood and its property values. When the federal government guaranteed Johnson's mortgage, it became implicated in the shoddy business practices of private sector agents bent on profiting from the desperation of low-income urban residents. Racially informed real estate practices were not the actions of an industry impervious to change and old in its ways. Instead, racial discrimination persisted in the new market because it was good business. In closing, when Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, he called for HUD to convene a special commission on housing policy in 1982. For more than 30 years, after pledging to provide decent homes for its citizens, the federal government and its Department of Housing continued to fail in the achievement of its goal. The latest Housing Commission, paneled by Reagan, called its report to House a Nation, and it began with a criticism of the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968. The HUD Act had left as its legacy, quote, a belief in the potency of government programs, read the Reagan Housing Report. The Commission on Housing promised the opposite, quote, the genius of the market economy, freed from the distortions forced by government housing policies and regulations that swung erratically from loving to hostile, can provide for housing far better than federal programs. It was a conclusion that could only be reached by ignoring the actual origins of the HUD Act and the reasons behind its demise. Lyndon Johnson had also promised the, quote, genius of private industry as the key to unlocking the mystery of perpetual housing crises. But lackadaisical management, erratic regulations, and trenchant racial discrimination, combined with the end of redlining and the predacious inclusion of formerly excluded Black urbanites, allowed the real estate industry to bleed inner cities dry. It was not government intrusion that sank the FHA-assisted low-income homeownership programs. It was government negligence. But this malfeasance was not just an issue of poorly motivated personnel. It was the outcome of mismatched objectives and impossible tasks. When public policies are guided by the objectives of private enterprise, as HUD's homeownership programs undoubtedly were, they are clenched in a dance of conflict. As magnanimous as the life insurance and other business titans who argued for socio-commercial enterprise in the 1960s tried to present themselves, in the end, the objective of profit making outpaced the necessity for safe and sound housing. The end of explicit racist exclusion ushered in a period of predatory inclusion, where the segregated housing market continued because it was profitable. The end result has meant perpetual housing insecurity for African Americans and the persisting racial wealth gap between Black and white families. The key to this is not the endless promotion of property ownership, but unhinging social mobility and life chances to ownership of an asset whose value is largely determined by deep-seated notions of race, culture, and belonging. Those attributes in the American housing market have twisted value in such ways that it accrues when in the hands of white buyers and sellers and declines in the hands of Black buyers and sellers. This is the race for profit, and yet another example of the inherent racial inequity embedded in American capitalism. Thanks.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Professor Taylor. It's just so wonderful to have you here to talk to our students. I was lucky enough to be introduced to your work by fellow historian Eileen Laura at Cal State Long Beach when I was trying to make sense of international tax. She said, well, you might want to read this person's work, and it really blew my mind. And I know that our students have had the same reaction. Now you'll see for yourself. Our students have been so deeply engaged with your work since the beginning of the year. The two students that you're going to meet now, Jahi Lieberd and Ramsha Ahmad, are not one else, but they are members of the law school's curriculum committee that have engaged with the other members, including faculty members, in the process of trying to build an affirmatively anti-racist curriculum. We can't do it without the students, and you'll see why. It's been so great to have them on board. They are going to ask you a series of questions that have been submitted in advance by the Wells, who are the point of our spear in this effort. So with that, I will turn the virtual mic over to Jahi and Ramsha, and take it away, guys. Let's see what you got.
Thank you, Professor Dean. Good night, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be a part of the panel. I know we're probably short on time, so let's just jump right in. The first question that we're going to put to you, Professor Taylor, a student wanted to know, actually, how did you learn about Janice Johnson and how did you go about meeting her? Further, they wanted to know, how did you decide to use her story as a case study to examine the predatory inclusion principle? And did you consider other stories similar to hers?
That's a fantastic question. The first thing I'll say is I talk a lot, so I will try to not, take 20 minutes to answer each question. So this is an interesting story. When I did this work primarily as the basis of research for my dissertation when I was a graduate student at Northwestern University in Chicago. So as a dissertation, this was a very Chicago-centric story. And then I got a job at Princeton, and I moved to the East Coast, and I moved to Philadelphia. And so when I moved to Philadelphia, my story changed. And it changed because I discovered that Philadelphia had a huge role in these low-income homeownership programs. And so, just reading, I've read a lot of newspapers from the time, from the early 1970s. And this was a kind of a period, an emergent period of investigative journalism. And so many newspapers had exposés on their kind of local variant of scandal involving these programs. And so Philadelphia had 2 waves of scandals involving these programs. But what I came to realize is that Philadelphia also filed one of the first class action lawsuits against HUD, trying to recoup the money that these poor Black women had invested in these houses for repairs. The lawsuit was intended to get their money back from HUD. And so I realized that, the name in one of the articles that appeared, his name was George Gould. He was with the legal aid organization called Community Legal Services. And I knew that CLS was still active in Philly. So I called and asked if George Gould was still there, 50 years later. And George Gould was still there. And so I asked, George if he'd like to meet to talk about this. He said, no one had asked him about these cases in 50 years. And so he was very happy to meet and talk to me. And, he had files and work related to the cases still at a warehouse off-site. And so the long answer to this question is that George Gould gave me several folders of depositions that he had taken of women who were involved in the class action lawsuit that he had filed. And Janice Johnson was one of the depositions in the file. So I didn't meet Janice Johnson. I read her deposition, and that story that I include in the introduction of the book is extracted from the deposition that she submitted as part of this class action lawsuit that was filed in 1970.
Good evening, everyone. I think I'm going to jump into the second question, but I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Ramsha Ahmad, and I'm a second year student at Brooklyn Law. So the second question from a student is kind of lengthy because when vetting these questions, we decided that, questions with common themes, we would just, kind of combine them and, as they were centered around the similar themes. So this student wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on how the disparity of minority home ownership affects the way minorities vote, as well as how it affects the types of concerns minority communities have when it comes to politics? To follow up, another student asked a question centered on your comment regarding the increased public recognition of Black Lives Matter. And you concluded that it is a positive development that people should press on and use as an opportunity to make further demands. They're wondering in what ways can this movement promote other racial minorities to speak up about their demands? And in reality, some of these demands might share similarity. Meanwhile, some of these demands might be conflicting. So if that's the case, how can we reconcile this situation in order to maximize our social welfare?
Okay. On the first thing with homeowners, I think that it's a hard question to answer. I think that one interesting thing is that Black homeownership has really stayed basically within the same range that it has been since the early 1970s, which is, I think, the highest number of Black homeowners has been, I think, 47% at the height of the kind of subprime lending bonanza in the early 2000s. And now it ranges from one quarter to the next, anywhere from 42 to 44%. And so really, there is almost a myopia around Black homeowners that that in some ways ignores the fact that most Black people are renters and live in the rental market. And so all of this stuff that we keep hearing about the increase in rents and the lack of affordable housing, I mean, the cost of rent has increased by 20% in the last year. In the last month, it has increased by 7%. There's an exponential rise in rent. And so this is disproportionately impactful for African-American families. So I think that is important to say. I think, Black homeownership is a mixed bag. I mean, part of the point that I try to make in the book is that even though Black homeownership or homeownership in general is seen as this kind of feature of what it means to be an American, that because of racial segregation and because of the ways in which race helped to shape property value in the US, that it has not been as beneficial to African Americans as an accruing asset as it has been to whites. And so I think, that has implications for the kinds of political concerns with African Americans who have often been victimized by unfair taxation, by unfair hikes in property values or property taxes. And so even though their homes are devalued because of where they're located and because of who they are located in proximity to, municipalities have tried to recoup unaccounted for wealth through raising property taxes on Black homeowners. And so, all of these very easily become political concerns and very easily become questions that are different for Black homeowners than they are for white suburbanites, for example, or white urbanites who own homes in gentrified areas where the values have increased exponentially. And so for me, a point of emphasis was just looking at the different experience of home ownership for African Americans compared to their white counterparts. I'll just say quickly about Black Lives Matter. I think that what the BLM movement has done has opened up a political space to think more deeply and to understand more deeply the nature of the problems in the United States, that see them as not superficial, but as substantial and systemic. And that's what social movements do. They force society to engage over a much longer duration of time on the problems that those social movements are directed at. Whereas most times there's fleeting attention to those problems in wake of a protest, or if something tragic happens, there's fleeting attention. A social movement slows down the fleeting attention and forces the entirety of society to focus on the nature of that problem. And in doing so, I think it opens up the possibility of showing that the problems are multifaceted, and that they're not just problems for Black people, but they're social problems much more generally. And so I think that that both creates a space in which other groups who experience some form of oppression or exploitation can use that space to also examine how those problems affect those people, but can also use the frameworks that inevitably are created through the process of political struggle, the tactics and strategies that are generated through political struggle to apply to their own. And I think that, one of the things that is important is that social movements also raise the possibility, if not the necessity, of solidarity between oppressed, marginalized, and exploited groups of people. And so to that extent, I think that the movement has helped to illuminate the possibilities for those things, but we also know that solidarity and making those types of connections is also political, and that it doesn't, meaning that there has to be some level of intentionality around them, that these types of connections and relationships that underlie solidarity don't just come into existence because they should. They don't come into existence because it's a good idea. If to whatever degree they do come into existence is because people understand that they are important for the longevity of the social movement, as well as for forging these different kinds of connections between people. And that is a product of political struggle and work. And so the movement itself opens up the possibility, but then actual people have to take advantage of that possibility through political organizing, theorizing, and strategizing.
Professor Taylor, I think you definitely hit the nail on the head. And a few more of our questions are going to be basically students asking how they could walk through that door that maybe, Black Lives Matter and different movements has opened up, how they could keep the door open and bring other people through with them. But the question I'm going to ask is not like that coming up. This is from a student who maybe has a slightly different viewpoint to you, but I thought it was probably important to include questions like this as well. The student asks, on the housing front, wouldn't it be a better solution to just build more housing? When it comes to funding this housing, they ask if there's a conflict between your call for investment in public housing but that you've also spoken about municipal governments abandoning institutions like public housing and letting them rot. If that's not a conflict of what is going to keep the public housing afloat. They suggested that building more housing through the private sector with a focus on density and walkability would create more economically viable and more integrated neighborhoods with a higher standard of living. They said they appreciate Professor Taylor's desire to provide public housing for the poorest people in our communities, but cordoning them off into high-rise housing projects would likely result in people being further removed from economic opportunities while giving them no stake in home ownership as a means of gaining wealth. And I know you already spoke on, having a house as a vehicle for gaining wealth for a Black person is different than other people. But yeah, I don't want to take away from his question. That is his question, Neil.
Well, no, that's a fantastic question. I mean, that's the key question is what do we do about the housing crisis? And I think part of the problem is that in this country, when you say public housing, when you say we need to build government finance managed housing, in this country, people's mind automatically turns to the worst housing, right? So I say we need more public housing. And the assumption is that, oh, this is housing for the poorest, housing of last resort for the poorest possible people that should be isolated and marginalized. That's what you're suggesting we build. No, but that is what our country has, that is the way that the concept of public housing has been distorted in our country to essentially spoil and undermine the idea that government should have anything to do with it. And so part of what I'm trying to illuminate, one is the history of where this idea came from. And so where does this idea come from that public housing necessarily means that you are warehousing the poorest people, putting them in marginalized, like physically marginalized housing on the margins of society, and that is our conception? Well, it comes from the way that public housing was constructed in this country, that the private sector lobby intervened in debates about how public housing should be constructed, where it should be constructed, and to whom it should be eligible for, who could live in the public housing. And so the private sector influence was that we want public housing to be the housing of last resort for only the poorest people who can't afford to buy into the private market. But we don't want the government competing with private housing. So if there's going to be a public housing program, we want this to be hideous housing. We want this to be housing that is punishing, that looks like it is a prison and not actual housing. And so how do they do that? Well, one way they do that is to manipulate who can be in public housing. So in public housing's first iteration in the 1930s, it was essentially open to any working class family, that you could have your entire family together. It wasn't relegated only to single mothers with who had no other housing options. It was open to anyone who was poor, working class, even middle class families that were between jobs. And so that represented a threat to the private sector. And so they lobbied to change the composition of who could live in public housing. And what did they also do? And this is the most important thing that they did. They lobbied to separate funding and financing for maintenance from as a part of the overall budget for maintaining public housing. And they changed that. They lobbied to have that changed so that now the financing for maintenance of these very complicated buildings would be based on the number of tenants in the building. Okay, but what happens when they continue to change the requirements of who is eligible for public housing so that the number of tenants continues to shrink while they're still in these incredible incredibly complicated buildings that actually need particular kinds of maintenance. So now the money available for maintenance is shrinking alongside the number of tenants who is also shrinking, so that by 1969 there is not enough money to actually maintain the buildings. And this is when the public not perception, the public presentation of public housing as rat infested, as falling apart, Pruitt-Igoe, begins to come into central focus. And so that is blamed on the tenants who live there, and not the fact that the federal government has created a funding formula that has encouraged the deterioration of the buildings. And so all of this is to say that the deterioration of public housing is the culmination of a series of policy choices, that it does not actually have to be that way, that we can have publicly financed, publicly built, publicly managed housing that looks like housing people want to live in. But that is a policy choice, to engage in that kind of building or to not engage in that kind of building. And so what I'm suggesting is that the degree of housing insecurity in this country is at such a magnitude that it is only the federal government that has the financial scale to address it. We can continue to go down the road of these little boutique programs where we have, 3 or 4 set-aside units in one building. We build 15 houses over here. You can even build 100 houses over there. But the fact is that tens of millions of people in this country are housing insecure. They are rent burdened, meaning they are paying more than 30% of their income towards rent. So we have a housing crisis that is exponentially expanding every single month at this point, and that the federal government has the financial capability and scale to address that. And the last thing I'll say about this, and I know it's a long answer, but I think this is an important question, is that if it was just as easy to say, well, we should have the private sector do this, then the private sector would have done it. This has been the policy for the last 50 years. This is what the Housing and Urban Development Act created, was private sector involvement in creating low-income home ownership, but also low-income rentals. And the problem is, you know why it doesn't work? Because private developers don't want to build housing for poor people. Look around New York. I just saw some ridiculous commercial. I'm actually in New York City. I'm in a hotel. It's a long story. Some Brooklyn Heights, Brooklyn Tower, some $950,000 condo with a 25-year rent or tax abatement if you buy this thing. That's where the market is. They're building $1 million condos because that's where the money is. They're not building housing for working class people. And that's why it doesn't get built. They've had tax credits for 50 years to build housing for poor people, and they don't build it because there's no money in it. They build housing for rich people. And that means that the problem continues to exist. Sorry.
So Professor Taylor, we would keep you here all night. We've got about 5 minutes left, and I'm going to ask Ramsha to offer one more question. And from my point of view, Professor Taylor, you gave the answer you want to give. We'll take any extra time you're willing to offer us. But why don't you go for it, Ramsha?
Yeah, sure. So Professor Taylor, this question goes to, the topic that you're just speaking about, the lack of affordable housing in New York City, and especially amidst, this debate about the eviction moratorium and the extension of that, but also goes to the topic of gentrification in neighborhoods. So the question is that activists have long fought for an expansion in available housing and often run up against not in my backyard, NIMBY, activists who fear gentrification in their neighborhoods. How do you think pro-housing advocates should approach the discussion with local groups? And what do you think are effective strategies to convince people to support more affordable housing development in their neighborhoods? Additionally, when navigating the world of real estate for the first time, what resources can new or labeled unsophisticated buyers use to protect themselves from predatory lenders or brokers?
So I will say that there's a lot of different layers to that question or questions. So what I would say is that part of the problem that we have, beginning with the last thing that you asked about people protecting themselves, is that people obviously should be able to protect themselves, but the reason why we create laws and regulations and public policies is understanding that sometimes people don't have the tools to protect themselves, right? That they don't have the expertise to protect themselves. And so we create regulatory structures, we invoke laws to help protect people. And part of the problem that we have in housing is that we have all sorts of laws on the books. And then we also have very relaxed regulation or enforcement of those laws. And so one of the things that needs to be evaluated, I mean, one of the examples I think about is Newsday, did a expose on racism among realtors, right? And the way that realtors on Long Island continue to steer Black people to Black majority neighborhoods, white people to white majority neighborhoods, Latinx people to Latinx majority neighborhoods. And so Newsday does a 3-year undercover investigation of real estate brokers on Long Island. Why is a news agency doing this? Like, why isn't the federal government actually paying for housing testing? Because that's all it was. It was good old fashioned housing testing. They sent, mixed different groups of people to these real estate brokerages and recorded them, recorded their interactions, which was legal. And, they put together this expose. And these are actions the government should be undertaking, but they don't. And so part of the point that I was trying to make with this book was understanding the phenomenon of agency capture, meaning that agencies that are in these embedded public-private partnership relationships then have difficulty regulating the private sector organizations that they work so intimately with. And so this is part of the breakdown in the regulatory apparatus that has left us with saying that the alternative then is financial literacy or real estate literacy. And you learn all the rules yourself so that you don't get taken advantage of in the real estate transactions. Now, obviously, you can know more or less about these transactions, but part of the emphasis here is that some of the dynamics that are underway are such that it's not really about your individual knowledge about the situation. It still is about the way that institutions are functioning that constantly put African Americans in exploitative situations. So we read all of the coverage about appraisers, housing appraisers, and the misappraisal of Black homes in relationship to white homes, where an appraiser will literally change the value of a house if you take all the pictures of the Black people off the walls and send your white neighbor to meet the appraiser instead of your Black self. I mean, this is outrageous. And so some of this goes beyond what the individual can know, suggesting that we look at the larger systemic forces that are underway. I think, and this will be the last thing that I will say about the issues of gentrification and the NIMBYs and what to do. I think that this is hard because part of the reason why this is so difficult is because what as a society we have invested in home ownership, and that we have created a system where the determinants dictating your quality of life, quality of after, retirement, all of these things is tied up in your ability to own property, to own a home. It is if it is an accruing asset, then it is what, may help facilitate your child's education, allow you to have a dignified retirement, allow you to weather a healthcare crisis. So there's lots of that is tied up in not just owning property, but owning property that can accrue in value. And because we have attached all of this to home ownership, and meanwhile left the state almost no role in weathering a healthcare crisis and being able to send your child to school, having a dignified retirement. This is all things that you have to do as an individual. It creates a hysteria around property value, right? And so that is what you are up against and in competition with when you then try to introduce housing or development that they perceive is a threat to the value of this thing that everyone is deeply attached to, because it determines what the course of your life may be, if your house is accruing in value or if it's not. And so it means that it's difficult then to conceive of, well, what is the strategy for dealing with that? Because it's not a particular strategy that you or I can come up with. And so in the meantime, I think that it means this is again why the power of the state becomes very important in terms of rezoning, in terms of demanding that people have a right to live somewhere, and that it can't just be up to the neighborhood group who is deciding about making these decisions based on purely on what it will do to the value of their property. And that in and of itself means that it's unpopular. But this has been an ongoing, at least 50-year debate. I talk about it in its iteration in the 1970s, which is where can poor and working class people live? And do homeowners in the suburbs and now in certain urban localities get to dictate that? And because that's really the question that we're asking is, do they get to dictate those terms? And so, I think that's part of what is difficult about the discussion, but a discussion that has to be had nonetheless.
Wow. Thank you, Ramsha. Thank you, Jahi. Thank you to all the 1Ls who submitted questions that we didn't even scratch the surface of. But no, there were over
questions on the table.
There were over 100, so we were never going to get to them all. But they were well curated by Jahi and Ramsha and Sophie as well, who wasn't able to be on camera today, but was part of the team as well. So thank you to Brooklyn Law School for making this happen. Thank you most especially to Professor Taylor for sharing her time with us. She's doing so much great work. I appreciate her taking some time away from that to share her great work with us in this really intimate way that this new era has allowed us to participate in. So we're grateful to you, Professor Taylor, for your time, for your wisdom, for joining us here at Brooklyn Law School to discuss these issues that are really so close to our heart here in Brooklyn, as you know, and we really just are so grateful to everyone. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, guys.